Welcome to this Thursday's devotional, Genesis chapter 4, verses 10 through 16. Cain has offered a sacrifice that was not accepted because it was, well, not his best. He did not have a view of God that was worthy of God. In his anger, he kills Abel, and he's confronted by God. He's not taking responsibility for his actions and attitudes. Sin is still mastering him. And in this context, God brings consequence to Cain. And there's an interesting phrase here where God says that Abel's blood is calling out from the very ground, that injustice. And this is an act of injustice. Cain, Abel had done nothing wrong, nothing to Cain. Cain had no reason to do this. There's injustice that happens, and injustice calls out to God to be made right. That is a theme that we'll see picked up again throughout the scriptures and the Old Testament prophets in the teaching of Jesus. But injustice, God will not leave unaddressed. And so God kind of gives two consequences to Cain in particular here. I'm going to mention the second one first because I won't talk as much about it. Second is that human sin seems to actually impact creation itself. And this is beyond the link that we could go, well, if I'm polluting the earth, or if we're doing something as humanity that is directly hindering, harming creation. So like just cutting down rainforest, for example, like crazy in some nations of the world, or chemical polluting. Well, I understand that greed or whatever the human sins that are motivating those practices. Well, I get that. That's directly harming creation, but there's a sense, not just here in Genesis 4, but as we go through again the scriptures, where the creation itself is scarred, harmed. Paul will say it's groaning, as we see in Revelation, that there's not just a new heaven, but a new earth. This creation needs to be redeemed, restored, renewed. And it's because of the impact of human sin. So just something to, again, there's no victimless sin. We have this idea at times, or can have, where I've heard people say, well, what I do by myself, my own private things, doesn't hurt anyone. That is not the biblical picture. It's hard for our scientific culture, and thinking to put this into our worldview, but this is the biblical worldview. I talked more about that than I meant to. Anyways, first consequence, second one I'm mentioning, God banishes Cain from Eden. Remember, there's the garden where God's presence is. There's the Eden, because the garden was placed in Eden, and then there's the world outside of Eden. This is the picture that Genesis, at least to this point, 1 through 4, has been presenting to us as readers. Cain is being banished from Eden into the outside world. So banished from God's presence, banished from Eden, banished from into the outside world, where there's obviously land and people there, because Cain says to God, I'm in trouble. I could be killed. He was afraid for his life. And God says to Cain, no, I will avenge you. I'm still with you. I still will have your back. And this is part of the interesting tension of God's rugged commitment to us, even when we may be walking away from him, as Cain is being pictured here. Cain is now going to experience what is the strongest consequence for walking away from God's ways in the Old Testament: exile. He's being exiled from Eden, just as Israel and Judah would be exiled from the promised land later on, as we see in the Old Testament. Cain left the Lord's presence, settled in the land of Nod, which the word there means wandering. So in the Hebrew, the original readers would have been hearing, he settled in wandering. It's not just about geography here. It's Cain has separated himself from God and put himself in a place where he does not have a place of belonging, of that settled fellowship, identity, community. He's settled himself, he's rooted himself in wandering. And so here's the question for us today. Is there something that you are not taking responsibility for, but passing off responsibility or passing on, misplacing your feelings onto someone else? Sometimes it's hard for us to see that. Maybe it's something you need to ask someone else or ask God. As you do today, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you. And today, would you know his peace? God bless.